Good evening, everybody. I'm Ken Baker, the current chairperson of the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group, a chair that revolves around a Christian, Jew and Muslim, and it's the turn of a Christian at this stage. So a very warm welcome to the 15th annual Peace Lecture. And most of you will be aware that following the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York, the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group was formed as a means of Jews, Christians and Muslims meeting, learning from each other and hopefully leading to more peaceful relations and understandings. And also at that time, the annual Peace Lecture, the first one presented by the Right Honourable David Longy. So the Peace Lectures have alternated since, Jewish presenter, Muslim and Christian. And it's a very special occasion that a Jewish presenter from Australia is with us tonight, responding to our warm invitation. So we look forward to that. And the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the University will present her, introduce her in a minute. So tonight, after the presentation, there'll be opportunity for questions, and Greg Hewson will facilitate that question time. A vote of thanks then by a representative of the Jewish community. And following that, you're all warmly invited to supper as a chance to further discuss and to engage with our presenter in the Hall of All Saints Church, which is just along Cumberland Street. So you're all very warmly welcome to meet there and continue conversations. And so tonight we also want to acknowledge financial contributions that have assisted in bringing Rachael with us, the Quaker Peace Grant, and also the Otago University Continuing Education Fund. And also tonight acknowledge apologies from the Chancellor, the Vice-Chancellor of the University here, and also David Clark, local MP. So I think with those general points, can I now invite Professor Helen Nicholson, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Otago University, to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you, Helen.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University to this lecture this evening. As Ken said, the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group was formed in the wake of September the 11th, and this is now the 15th Peace Lecture. And arguably there is still a very great need for us to think about how we can achieve peace, both within the community and the wider world. Over the last 15 lectures, there have been a series of distinguished speakers from across the three Abrahamic faiths and across different parts of the world. And this evening's lecture is also a very distinguished speaker. Dr. Rachael Kohn was brought up in Ontario, Canada, and studied religious studies at McMaster University. And she then received a Leverhulme postdoctoral fellowship to study at the University of Lancaster, before taking up a lectureship at the University of Sydney. She was then lured away from academia into journalism, and for the last 25 years, she has presented and produced programs on religion and spirituality for the Australian ABC radio network, and in particular has presented the program The Spirit of Things, which has been running for 21 years. As well as her radio work, Rachael also has published 2 books and written numerous book chapters. She's been involved with interfaith activities with Griffith University, and she was awarded a Doctor of Letters honoris causa by the University of New South Wales for her role in fostering religious understanding. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Rachael to give her lecture this evening entitled, Can We Think Our Way to Peace?
I should have known as a radio person to turn on the microphone. It's a great honor to be here. I've always wanted to come to Dunedin, and the first few minutes I arrived, I thought it should be renamed Eden. It is such a wonderful, beautiful place to live, and the university is very impressive indeed. However, we have a problem. We're all part of the world, and the world is in conflict. I have called this, Can We Think Our Way to Peace? And, well, I think that's the first starting point. I was recently walking through the colossal remains of a once glorious civilization that was ancient Greece. It was the home of democracy, of analytical philosophy, of the Archimedean mix of mathematics, engineering, and astronomy, which together made possible some of the most magnificent structures ever built. Temples of awesome size, built of the finest white marble, chiseled out of high mountains, transported long distances, and erected with impressive speed, precision, and beauty. The most authoritative book on the building of the Acropolis concludes that with today's methods, we could not build it in the record 8 years that it took the ancients. But as I took in the sheer miracle of these huge structures that defied the passage of 2,500 years, I also found myself clambering over many more that were destroyed. A mere jumble of broken columns, lintels, capitals, and building blocks. I was face to face with the apex of construction and the nadir of destruction, of noble ideals, as well as the carnage that trampled them. We often ignore the rubble and the stories buried underneath it because we only have eyes for the lovely things that remain, the baubles, the buildings, the frescoes, the golden mosaics, and the sculptures, even when they are headless and armless, invite us to admire the beauty, and we want to possess them. Think of all the booty that visitors to these ancient lands snaffled in their luggage and spirited away to museums or onto their own mantelpieces. We are attracted to pretty, glittering things, the way bowerbirds collect anything that is bright blue. And then, perhaps over a glass of wine or a cup of tea, we sigh about the faded remnants of the grandeur that was once ancient Greece or Rome. Their heads all in a row were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching, for a while, but not for long. Those lines are from the most beloved ancient Greek epic poem, the Odyssey, by Homer. You might recognize them. They recount how Odysseus returned to Ithaca after being away for years and launched himself into a war of vengeance against his wife's suitors. The triumphant Odysseus commanded that the suitors' female slaves also be killed. They were the ones hanging by their necks, feet twitching, but not for long. The tragedy that I saw in Greece, and especially in Sicily, where some of the most beautiful Greek temples are to be found, was not just the tumble-down condition of these once proud structures, similar to the destruction of Syrian antiquities that we witnessed in our own day. The tragedy is what we don't see, the thousands of people who were tortured and massacred, strung up, beheaded, crucified, expelled, and enslaved in what was a constant onslaught of warring peoples, the Dorians, the Carthaginians, that is, the Phoenicians from Carthage, the Persians, the pirates, then the Romans, the Goths, and the Visigoths, the Venetians, and then 400 years of the Ottomans. And that is to say nothing of the internal warfare and internecine power struggles that often tore at the fiber of every one of these proud groups from within. You could easily consign all this carnage to the barbarism of the past, but having just mentioned ISIS and Syria, where over 400,000 people have been killed in its recent civil war, plus many more exiled, I won't avoid the relevant question, which is, how was it that emperors, kings, and their local governors cared so little about the fate of the people, so long as they could enrich themselves and extend their own territory and power? Why, instead of building great structures and expanding their empires, did leaders not build up a culture and a value system that cherished all human life and establish a world of cooperative communities? Why did they not create a lasting peace rather than fight over the temporary riches of empire? Recently, taking a cab into the city where I live, Sydney, my Afghan taxi driver extolled the beauty of the morning, and then he launched into a spontaneous monologue that lasted the whole trip about the responsibility he has to make each and every day a beautiful experience, regardless of the adversity he finds, or the people he encounters who are sometimes angry or just inconsiderate. Love and gratitude for being alive is a practice to be engaged in from the time you wake up, he said, every day and every moment. And he believed that it would be repaid in full. Life will be more pleasant. He confessed, I'm a Muslim, but all those divisions mean nothing to me now. We're all human. We're all part of nature, the animals, the plants. We need to care for it all. I was greatly moved by this man's spontaneous sermon, which clearly emerged from a troubled past in war-torn Afghanistan, a benighted country fought over by so many peoples from both within and outside of it, where Shia Muslim shrines and schools are regularly blown up by Sunni Taliban. But I hoped that the deep truth which he arrived at was not at the expense of religion, as if Islam were incapable of that reverence for life. Yet I was also aware of how his gratitude at being alive could only have arisen in a country like Australia, where freedom and peaceful coexistence was not just possible and guaranteed by our secular structures, but also stem from the religious roots of our culture. He is one of the lucky ones, because hatred and conflict, when entrenched in culture and society, are hard to unlearn. Witness the 100 Sudanese youth exhibiting the reckless violence in Melbourne just recently. That was the normal modus operandi back home, injuring innocent civilians and trashing property. Yet for every 10 disgruntled and alienated people, there is perhaps one or two, like the Afghan taxi driver, who sees an opportunity in our relatively peaceful society to live abundantly without resentments and even with something approximating joy. Sometimes they are natural-born teachers, like the Somalian Muslim woman I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing. She came to Melbourne by way of Kenya and Saudi Arabia, escaping the never-ending war in her homeland, and the enforced seclusion of women in Saudi Arabia, which left her, a Black African, particularly lonely. Mariam Issa calls herself the Black Muslim of Brighton. And she admitted it wasn't easy to fit into her new Australian home. She is tall, dark, and wears a turban in a white middle-class suburb. But she was curious about her society and wanted to know more about these mothers in tights who pushed prams, talked into their mobiles while drinking cafe latte. Rather than withdraw and remain suspicious of them, she decided to work for them, cleaning house, talk to them, learn about their culture, and particularly the culture of her new surrounds. Mariam Issa has a positive outlook, which she said she learned partly from a Buddhist teacher when she was feeling rather sorry for herself, as well as from her brave storytelling African mother. It was her desperation, together with a keen intellect, that prompted her to question her own frame of mind, which was holding her back. She realized that if you're truly accepting and open and interested in the people around you, rather than being threatened by them, they will be open and interested in you. You get back what you give out. It's as simple and as hard as that. She founded RAW, Resilient Active Women, and has been a wonderful role model of integration for other immigrant women who feel isolated and alien in Melbourne. These two examples show that the stark divisions and gaps between people, which can easily erupt into violent conflict, or at least simmer in suspicious mistrust, can be overcome by an attitude of mind. Very likely, the warring peoples in antiquity had the opposite attitude of mind. And what is that? Alan Jacobs, a Christian and distinguished professor of humanities at Baylor University, has described it in his recent book, How to Think, A Guide for the Perplexed. And let me pause here because I think I have forgotten to show you some of the images. This, by the way, is an image of the Odyssey. And that is Mariam Issa, who stood out in Brighton, the Brighton suburb of Melbourne. And this is Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think. The title, the subtitle, echoes the seminal work by the medieval Jewish philosopher Moses ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, who wrote the 12th century classic Guide for the Perplexed, a book that was influential in Christian circles as well, but I'll return to that later. In fact, Alan Jacobs is a bit of a collector of good ideas from many people, so a typical academic. The term he borrowed from Susan Friend Harding is one I'll use here. Susan was a graduate student in anthropology and wanted to write her PhD on evangelical Christians, but found herself blocked by her professors. Why study them? They feared she might be a secret sympathizer. Years later, she realized her professors regarded evangelical Christians as RCOs, repugnant cultural others. Having RCOs is a habit of mind that is unfortunately pervasive today. It consists of regarding whole groups, countries, or individuals as utterly repugnant, objectionable, beyond the pale, and totally opposite to yourself. Crucially, to those you seek approval from. In fact, you are likely to have adopted a list of RCOs from your social group almost as a requirement for acceptance. Now here's a question. How often do you ritually reinforce your bond with your social group by mentioning RCOs with smug disapproval? And here's a more embarrassing question. Who are the people or groups you regard as RCOs? Are they Jews? Are they Zionists? Are they Christians, homosexuals, Muslims, Greens, capitalists, Brexit supporters, Americans, right-to-life supporters, pro-choice supporters, Catholics, priests, atheists, politicians, climate skeptics? Are they Australians? Who are the groups that make up your list of RCOs? I would venture to guess that most likely none of you regard people of other race as an RCO, because today it is widely frowned upon to be openly racist in our middle-class Western settings, thankfully. When did you last see a television debate between people of different race accusing each other of objectionable inherited characteristics and behaviors? I haven't, and I'm glad that I haven't. But what I have seen are TV debates that openly encourage people to shout accusations at each other on matters of religion, climate, sexuality, politics, ideology, and morality. Shouting insults, hurling accusatory questions, preventing someone from speaking is not just acceptable, it's a great spur to television ratings. People are made to cheer from the sidelines. Audiences are planted with rabble-rousers. Clearly, there's a double standard about who is an acceptable RCO. A recent case in point was the Hollywood personality Roseanne Barr, who had a track record of saying and doing extremely objectionable things. After a long absence from TV, she returned and boosted her profile by tweeting about Barack Obama's advisor, Valerie Jarrett, a black woman who was born to American parents in Iran. Roseanne called her a cross between the Muslim Brotherhood and Planet of the Apes. Roseanne was deservedly reprimanded, and her show was swiftly canceled. But 2 days later, a US comedian, Samantha Bee, called the US president's daughter, Ivanka, a feckless C-U-N-T on her TV program, and went on to say that Ivanka should wear a low-cut dress and shimmy up to her father and talk to him about refugees. Samantha Bee's TV show was not canceled. She wasn't punished. Some RCOs are more acceptable than others. When I was a graduate student in Canada, some of my cohort voiced anti-American slogans and cultivated an us and them rhetoric. In a bid to elevate their Canadian identity, they needed to put down America and Americans. To be Canadian meant not being an American. This view was so pervasive that today, people who mistake Canadians for Americans make abject apologies as if they just called them a troglodyte. At the time, I thought it was more than a bit rich, since we Canadians lapped up American TV and goods in every variety, and we enjoyed culturally, morally, politically, linguistically, religiously, and materially almost everything that Americans did. In fact, most of the popular American comedians were in fact Canadians, and all their best hockey players were Canadians. Not to mention that we shared the longest peaceful border. Canadians had also fought alongside Americans against the fascist takeover of Europe, and those of us from European backgrounds were ever grateful that they did. We were alive because of it. Who we leave off our RCO list is also telling. For example, at the same time they were denouncing America, the students had no incentive to call China to account, which under the communist Maoist regime was responsible for the enforced death of 45 million of its own people in a 4-year period under the Great Leap Forward project from 1958 to 1962. On the contrary, students clutched Mao's little red book reverently. Why were China's vast crimes against humanity ignored by a student populace who claimed to be lovers of freedom, liberty, and life? The answer was not hard to fathom. Students were protesting the Vietnam War, and in doing so turned a blind eye to China and the China-backed communist regime of Pol Pot. Those are photographs from the Great Leap Forward. And of course, that is one of the famous photographs of Pol Pot, the effect of Pol Pot's killing fields. They were overlooked and downplayed, most famously by the American academic Noam Chomsky. Why did students hold such contradictory attitudes? It's basic sociology. To quote the Cambridge novelist and theologian C.S. Lewis, they wanted to be members of an inner ring and boost their stature by adopting a raft of prejudices that were ready-made for them. RCOs act as a kind of password, a term of acceptance. But you know passwords. They're hard to remember. So one of the features of having an RCO, or a list of them, and you know how hard it is to keep a list of passwords, is that you have to keep reinforcing your view of them in order to maintain your sense of belonging to your group. It means you have to shun others who question it, the way cults punish their dissenters. Essentially, in order to accuse others of being an RCO or repugnant cultural other, you must know as little about them as possible, keep your distance, and repeat thought-terminating cliches, which prevent you from ever entering into their way of thinking about anything. And if you're an activist on the ground, then you have to keep throwing Molotov cocktails, lobbing missiles, marching with hostile placards, burning flags and effigies, keeping up the fight, teaching your children to hate, and never coming to the table to imagine a future together based on respect and cooperation. Now think of the impersonal internet, where every tweet or blog or Facebook post is eager to win supporters, measured in the number of likes. It's a very quick way to gain social approval, even when it's shallow and instant and is rarely thought through. Nonetheless, social media delivers instant gratification and reinforces your status as part of an in-crowd, at least for the moment, while at the same time it ramps up divisions and stokes hatreds. Of course, many people would never admit to harboring hatreds, just well-worded arguments. But the very thing that prevents you from engaging with others whom you've identified as repugnant because you disagree with them is probably very close to contempt. And the ironic thing about maintaining a distance from people who hold different views from yours is that it is often a strategy you or your group employs to prevent finding out that you actually share quite a bit in common. So you see, you can think your way to hate, to war, and to violence, even while you believe that you are on the side of the good. But how do we think our way to peace? Because without the thoughts, the practice of peace is not possible. How good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together, says the psalmist in Psalm 133. Not sure if this is, yes. Yet even in the Bible, the book of Genesis contains stories of Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, and the brothers of Joseph, which also show that it is rare for brothers to dwell together in harmony. And this is it's really a charcoal sketch by Marc Chagall of Joseph and his brothers. And yet, observes Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in his book, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence, it is possible to dwell in harmony. And until it has been shown to be possible, the human story cannot continue. Each child of Jacob, like each of the 70 nations and languages of Genesis 10, has his own character and contribution. Each will become a tribe, and only as a confederation of tribes can Israel exist. Similarly, only as a confederation of nations can the world exist. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks is today's most consistent and widely respected interfaith theologian. I recall years ago interviewing an imam from Bristol who told me that Sacks's book, To Heal a Fractured World, was his Bible, quote unquote. In numerous books, Sacks expounds the theological foundation that we must excavate or rebuild among the rubble of history in order to stand together as a community of nations, each with our differences, but each having a right to exist. The biblical book of Genesis, it should be remembered, is not a prescription of all people to be the same, nor for all people to have the same customs, skin color, priests, or language. Genesis affirms the incommensurability, that is, the uniqueness of the human person and of different civilizations, says Sacks. We are all different, but we each carry in our being the trace of the one God. God cares for all he creates. More than we have faith in God, God has faith in us. Sacks's undeniably religious view is that although we are all different, because identity is plural, it is the trace of God in all of us that is our common bond. It is more, much more than saying we are all human, because it transcends human differences and carries with it the maxim that every life is sacred, which carries with it a responsibility. What is it? The unity of God asks us to respect the stranger, the outsider, the alien, because even though he or she is not in our image, their ethnicity, their faith, or their culture is not ours, nonetheless, they are in God's image. It is the only ground on which we can truly live a peaceful life among the nations. But Sacks admits that it takes work to realize this, because there's a tendency to think in terms of sibling rivalry as deeply rooted, genetically encoded in the human mind. It's a view, of course, made popular by the 16th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who viewed violence as the natural order of things. Our scientific materialism favors such insights, and we readily attribute our bad behavior to this diagnosis of the human condition, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Indeed, without God, there's a propensity to view humankind as simply a manifestation of nature, raw in tooth and claw. But as Greg Sheridan, the author of God is Good for You, A Defense of Christianity in Troubled Times, recently said, if the human species is regarded as simply a transient part of nature, it means you are no more and no less important than a cockroach. Religions, even those with a heightened reverence for all sentient beings, bestow humans with higher expectations. Expectations higher than their natural instincts. Religions also imbue human beings with moral aspirations that compel us to uphold our most treasured values, including peace. Yet even religions can be infiltrated by flawed interpretations. They can be tainted by our worst human tendencies. In other words, religions can be deployed to love some and to hate others. A program called Muslim Woman's Magazine, with host Doa Amer, showed her interviewing a child. "What's your name?" "Basmala." "Basmala, how old are you?" 3.5. "Are you a Muslim?" "Yes." "Basmala, are you familiar with the Jews?" "Yes." "Do you like them?" "No." "Why don't you like them?" "Because they're apes and pigs." "Because they are apes and pigs. Who told you so?" "Our God." "Where did he say this?" "In the Quran." The interviewer concludes, "Basmala, Allah be praised. May our God bless her. No one could wish Allah a more believing girl than she. May Allah bless her and her father and mother. The next generation of children must be true Muslims. We must educate them now, while they are still children, so that they will be true Muslims." Now, do you believe educating Muslims to hate Jews is a sign of a true Muslim? I would hope no one here thinks so. But unfortunately, that is an instruction often heard in sermons across the Muslim world, including in the diaspora. The Quran refers to Jews as apes and swine in 3 places, Surah 2, 63 to 65, Surah 5, 59 to 60, and Surah 7, 16. In fact, Muslim scholar Ed Hussein, who 10 years ago founded the Quilliam Institute in London to empower moderate Muslim voices, says, the word Yahud, or Jew, has become almost a profanity, bearing connotations of perennial enmity and plotting against Islam and Muslims. None of this is helped, he said, by the existence of hadiths that contradict the Quran and intensify anti-Jewish animus, such as, "O slave of God, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." But the Quran, in 49:13, also says, "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of male and female, and made you into nations and tribes, that ye may know each other," presumably that you may not despise each other. And some modern Muslims refer to this passage as a foundation for respecting people of all faiths. The New Testament also has its infamous passages referring to Jews as of your father the devil, John 8:44, and as you snakes and brood of vipers, Matthew 23:31 to 33, and refers to their synagogue as the synagogue of Satan in the book of Revelation 2 and 3. Today, these are recognized as having been the source of lethal anti-Semitism throughout the ages, which laid the groundwork for the Holocaust. After the annihilation of 6 million of Europe's Jews, the churches in the second half of the 20th century, including the Catholic, the Lutheran, and the Anglican, and some other denominations, officially rejected these descriptions of Jews and Judaism in our day, and have taught their congregants and students that anti-Semitism is evil. It was the Jewish philosopher I mentioned earlier, Moses Maimonides, of the 12th century in Spain and North Africa, who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed precisely to make the point that the plain reading of Scripture could lead to error. Words themselves could not yield their full meaning, but they required skillful interpretation to ensure that people do not fall into idolatry of either the text or of God. In reference to God, for example, descriptions in the Torah would have you believe that God had arms and legs and ears and hands and other human traits. But God is never contained by physical limitations alone. These are but metaphorical or symbolic descriptions in the Hebrew Bible, which allow only glimpses of an utterly transcendent God, a shape-shifter, if you will, who could communicate with his creatures in myriad ways. In fact, the view that Maimonides expressed was already written and expressed by Muslim scholars within about 16 years of the death of Muhammad. 6 centuries before Maimonides, Imam Ali and Jafar Sadiq, who both emphasized the Quran's multiple meanings and warned that it was not to be read nor its injunctions implemented literally. Just as God as is Zahir and Batin, which means outward and inward, his book, the Quran, also has inner and outer meanings. This kind of subtle understanding of the text, this rejection of mere literal interpretation, opened the way for rabbis and also Christian theologians such as Thomas Aquinas, who was greatly influenced by Maimonides, to rescue biblical texts from blunt interpretations and allowed them to speak about the mystery of God to humanity in any age and in any place. Literalist readings of sacred texts, however, are not the only fuel of anti-Semitism today, just as it was not when Hitler gained power in Germany and Austria and infected all of Europe with Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda, which led to the mass murder of 6 million of European Jews. It is an unfortunate fact that barely 70 years after the Holocaust, a mere 16 million Jews today in the world are fending off an international tide of anti-Semitism that has now taken root in the universities and in media organizations. And it has come here to New Zealand. When I was last in Auckland, I was delighted to discover that I was staying in a hotel a mere 5-minute walk from an old Jewish cemetery. So I visited it and was shocked to discover about 10 or 12 headstones covered with large swastikas. Today, in beautiful Dunedin, similar desecrations have occurred, and just 3 weeks ago, materials fomenting hatred of Jews was dropped into post boxes. Those are some of the desecrations that we have become used to seeing now. It's deeply disturbing to see this trend growing. The latest study of violent attacks in France showed that 40% of these violent attacks were against Jews, who make up less than 1% of the population. These attacks were against old women, fathers, children, ordinary people walking down the street, a survivor of Auschwitz living in her apartment in her 80s. People shopping in a kosher store, picking up children at school and entering a synagogue. Indeed, in France recently, Muslim leaders refused to sign a joint interfaith declaration condemning anti-Semitism, as had been done in the UK, where it is on the march. It was the front page of the Australian Jewish News, which made my heart leap with joy. It was about a Bosnian Muslim family honored by Yad Vashem, the Memorial Museum of the Holocaust in Jerusalem. Avdo, Esma, Sabrija, and Safita Prohik were all recognized as the righteous among the nations for their efforts to save Aviva Fox, who had been orphaned in the Holocaust. She and her cousin petitioned for their recognition, and it was a hugely moving ceremony for everyone. Are these? Oh, okay. But it's also no secret that the Muslim world, that is 59 Muslim majority nations and their diasporas, regard Jews and Israel with enmity. Ed Hussein's new book, The House of Islam, A Global History, contains a special chapter on Jews, in which he cites the Pew Research Center's study of anti-Semitism among Muslim nations, showing that it runs as high as 95% and averages between 80 and 90%. Even the moderate Muslim nation of Indonesia mounted violent protests when a Muslim leader interested in interfaith solutions to social friction in his country visited Israel earlier this year. Yaha Stakuf, Secretary General of the 60 million member Nadlatul Ulama, representing traditionalist Sunni Islam, said he, quote, has identified portions of Islam that he considers problematic, including how Muslims interact with non-Muslims, because, he said, they're not compatible anymore with the current reality of our civilization. He said there needs to be a new discourse to recognize that Muslims and non-Muslims are equal and should be able to coexist peacefully. Judaism, for example, is not recognized as an official religion in Indonesia, although there is a Jewish community and historic synagogues, while Protestantism, Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, along, of course, with the majority Islam, are recognized as legitimate. Even the rejection of the only Jewish nation in the world as illegitimate and destined for obliteration goes against the Quran, which says Allah assigned Israel to the Jews until the day of judgment, Surah 5, verse 21, and that Jews are the inheritors of Israel, Surah 26, verse 59. And in Surah 17, we, Allah, said to the children of Israel, dwell securely in the promised land, and when the last warning will come to pass, we will gather you together in a mingled crowd. Why are Israel and Jews viewed as a collective RCO, not only by Muslims, but now by a large number of students who have adopted their view? Does this make any sense? Israel is about 1/13 the size of New Zealand and twice the population. When European Jews started returning to their ancestral and religious land in the 19th century, joining existing centuries-old communities in Sfad and Jerusalem, and making new ones, Mark Twain, the famous American writer, described the land as virtually empty scrub and desert, uncultivated, sustaining very small and impoverished settlements, which a traveler would have to go 30 miles in any direction to encounter. Israel was not a colonial acquisition of the Jews, since they were returning to their ancestral land, which they purchased in parcels from absentee Turkish landlords and resident Arabs. They had no other land, having been first expelled and then exterminated from their European homes. The immigrants and new refugees were joined by 850,000 Jews who were turned out of their Middle Eastern homes after the creation of Israel. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration to establish a Jewish national home was adopted by the principal Allied powers. In 1922, the League of Nations codified it into international law, and it was sanctioned by all 51 member states of the League. In 1917, in 1936, and 1947, the proposal to make the area into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, was accepted by the Jewish population and rejected by the Muslim population, a position still held by the Palestinian National Charter, which declares the UN partition of Palestine in 1947 and the establishment of the State of Israel as entirely illegal. End of quote. The key influence on the latter was Yasser Arafat's uncle, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem from 1921 to 1937, Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, who supported Hitler, recruited Bosnian troops for him in 1943, visited him in Berlin, and wrote to him for advice on how to implement the final solution on the Jews in Israel. Predictably, he rejected the 1947 UN vote, directly after which 5 Arab countries and 3 additional supporters, totaling 8, launched a war against the Jewish state in 1948. Most of the land, it should be remembered, however, was granted to the Hashemite king, despite being on the losing side of World War II, and it was renamed Transjordan, from which all the Jews were expelled. Nabil Amro, a former Palestinian information minister who was involved in the peace talks at Camp David, told the media line, "There is regret on the Palestinian side for not having accepted the original partition plan. Now we cannot go back in time and demand the same things." On the other hand, he elaborated, the Israelis were smarter, and Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, had the foresight to take what was offered and build on it. Near the end of his term, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, in his opening speech to the 61st General Assembly in September 2006, admitted that Israel is often unfairly judged by the international body and its various organizations. On one side, supporters of Israel feel that it's harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often, he said, this is true, particularly in some UN bodies. But despite his and many other observations of that nature, it has not changed significantly in the last 12 years. Compare Pakistan, 38 times larger than Israel, a country declared in 1947 and constituted by removing 10 million Muslims from India and expelling Hindus from the newly Muslim nation. In the first year of Pakistan's existence, 1 to 2 million people were killed. In 70 years, the number killed in the wars and the intifadas mounted against Israel have resulted in just over 100,000 deaths. It is, of course, 100,000 too many and should not have happened. That figure, however, does not even include the deaths caused by Palestinian terrorism in the diaspora, which killed many more. And of course, one remembers the bombing of the Israel Embassy and the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that killed up to 100 people or more. Take Burma, now Myanmar, a country formed in 1948 also. For 70 years, it has been in a state of civil war with a population of 51 million and a history of juntas, child armies, child slavery, mines, landmines, and population displacements. There is nothing like democracy on the ground, despite the hopes of Aung San Suu Kyi. By comparison, the Jewish nation, which grants equal citizens' rights and religious freedom to its religiously and culturally diverse population, including Jews, Muslims, Druze, Baha'is, and any number of new religions, as well as atheists, has also, for the sake of peace, given up some of its ancient sacred sites, such as the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron, the Temple Mount, and Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem. And yet today, the country that was established as the Jewish national home early in the 20th century is now accused of racism and apartheid because it has enshrined into constitutional law its Jewish status, no different from countless countries that take for granted their religious identity. 30 Muslim nations recognize Islam as their state religion, with laws that directly affect their religious and cultural minorities. 7 Buddhist nations, 7 Roman Catholic countries, Scotland, England, 4 Lutheran countries, 2 Eastern Orthodox countries have their established religions and their official languages, to name just a few. None of these nations are accused of apartheid, and yet the Edinburgh University Student Association, in a lengthy statement, voted to boycott Israel after the law declaring it a Jewish national home. The Middle East specialist and graduate of Edinburgh University and Cambridge University, Dr. Dennis McEwen, who's not Jewish, responded to this brazen act of ignorance by pointing out that the accusations made against Israel are not just wrong, but deeply anti-Semitic. There is no other way to explain the contemptuous lies that accuse Israel of Nazism and of South African apartheid, a country where some of the most persecuted people in the world, including Ahmadi Muslims, Baha'is, and Ethiopian Jews, find freedom and equality in every walk of life. It goes without saying that Israel alone, of the Middle Eastern countries, grants full freedom of expression, including gay pride parades, to people who identify as LGBTIQ. Israel is a country where Arabs are members of parliament, and they're often extremely critical, and where Arabic is an official language, where Arabs attend universities, where an affirmative action policy has been in place since 1999. But next door in Gaza, Hamas Political Bureau member Fatih Hamad, at a July 12th rally in Gaza, proclaimed, "We are looking forward to 2 important things which are within sight. The first is the cleansing of Palestine of the filth of the Jews. By 2022, we will be rid of them. The second thing is the establishment of the caliphate after the nation has been healed of its cancer, the Jews. Allah willing, O Netanyahu, O Lieberman, we are coming to chop off your head from your necks." This sounds extreme, but as Ed Hussein has noted, I can name dozens of Muslim clerics, important formulators of public opinion, in a region dominated by religion, who will readily condemn acts of terrorism against the West, but fall silent when it comes to condemning Hamas. And if thousands of rockets launched from Gaza into Israel were not enough, this year over 1,000 incendiary kites were parachuted into Israel to set the country aflame. They burned 10,000 acres of forest and agricultural land in a country 1/13 the size of Israel, of New Zealand. That is 1/13 the size of New Zealand, causing tens of millions of dollars in damage and destroying the food crops of hundreds of farmers. The task then today is how to respond to this demonization and the physical attacks, which have turned Jews, once again, into RCOs, repugnant cultural others, and has attempted to make Israel a pariah nation. I have no illusions about what a change of heart toward Israel would do for the wars engulfing various parts of the world. Peace between the Palestinian leaders and Israel will not change the deadly conflicts in the Sudan, Somalia, and Syria. It won't stop the civil war in Myanmar and in Venezuela. It won't reduce the hatred between the Turkish government and the Kurdish independence movement. It certainly won't halt the march of Boko Haram in Nigeria, nor will it cool the fires between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is based on a historic division between the Sunni and Shia Muslims. But it will mean something deeply significant for the Abrahamic faiths. The God of Abraham was first recognized by Jews in antiquity, well before Christianity and Islam emerged. Yet both these latter faiths looked to the founding stories of the Bible as their initial inspiration. The God of the Bible was above nature, as the story of Genesis makes clear, and yet chose to create the human species in his image. Many have reflected on what this means, but I look again to Jonathan Sacks from his book, Faith in the Future, to discover what this might mean for us. Creation testifies not merely to God's power, but also, as it were, to his belief in mankind. At the heart of religion is not just the faith we have in God. No less significant is the faith God has in us. To do what with? I think the creation story from Genesis has written into our very being and consciousness that we humans are capable of rising above our nature and not slavishly determined by it, as the Marxist or neo-Darwinian view would have us believe. We have the ability to consciously choose our thoughts, to willfully change our response, and thereby transform both ourselves and the world around us. Today, there is a renewed interest in the Greek philosophers as guides for living. But although they were keen to articulate what it is to be an ideal human being, some Greeks did not regard non-Greeks as fully human. Plato believed only men were created directly by the gods and given souls, while women and slaves were not regarded as fully human. How different is the biblical concept that sets God's image in each of us, thereby making every life sacred? It is godliness that is universal, while human beings are all different. The heirs of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can show that singular truth to the world by interpreting their sacred texts in a way that is always mindful of that fact and in acting towards each other in ways that demonstrate it. In To Heal a Fractured World, Jonathan Sacks says, having faith in God means having faith in other people. And the measure of our righteousness lies in how many people we value, not in how many we condemn. It is not a new idea. The chief rabbi of pre-state Israel, Abraham Cook, said, because that which connects human thought and feeling with the infinite and all-surpassing divine light must be refracted into a multiplicity of colors, so every people and society must have a different spiritual way of life. And in the first century, when Israel was under the boot of the Romans, Rabbi Akiva said, beloved is every human person, for he or she is in the image of God. Beloved is Israel, for each of us is one of the children of God. And echoing that sentiment, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has said, we feel ourselves close to God, but we equally believe that God has a relationship with all humanity. Rabbi Akiva was tortured and martyred by the Romans, his skin scraped with iron tongs while still alive. But Judaism does not remember him as a martyr. Most Jews would not even know that fact. Akiva is remembered as one of the greatest and most humble teachers of antiquity. Despite the essential godliness we share, human beings often fall into conflict. But war is not inevitable because hate is a choice. As it says in the book of Leviticus, do not hate your brother in your heart. Scold him, admonish him, but do not hate him. When religion consecrates hate, it leads to violence. When religion urges dialogue, it leads to understanding. This is a realistic approach to our human diversity because it does not banish conflict, nor teach that it is subhuman. On the contrary, conflict is all too human. But biblical faith teaches us it is only our nature, not our essence. We are not simply material beings driven by our instincts. We have within us the transcendent quality that is variously called soul, spirit, consciousness, which all religions have identified as the sacred quality of our being and which unites us, if only we remember it. Zakar in Hebrew, zikr in Arabic means to remember, and it refers to remembering our connection with God. In Latin, it's Memories Dei. I was struck by the similarity in the words of the Brahma Kumari teacher, Sister Shivani, India's most popular motivational speaker, who said simply, remember that divine connection in everything you do. Surrender to it, and you will radiate that transcendent quality of peace and love in your attitude and relationships. Sister Shivani also said that all religions teach this, but we've got attached to the teacher and not the teaching, causing divisions and comparisons. It is our job then in the interfaith movement, for the sake of those who have forgotten, to remember the teaching that the essence of our being is the Spirit, and the Spirit is shalom. It is peace, which is why we greet each other and say shalom in Hebrew, salam aleikum in Arabic, which means peace be with you, as the Christians say. Words have wings, and that is a quote from Homer. When we meet each other and remember that, then we will always have an outflow of the positive feelings of love and kindness, which can, I believe, change our world for the better. Thank you.
Okay, we have time now for questions. Thank you very much, Rachael. That was a powerful lecture. Questions, comments? Anyone? We have 5 minutes at least before supper, 10 minutes. It's a lot to think about there. Yes.
Such a powerful address. I wonder if it's available for people to read again and again and to share.
I believe this, sorry, I'm holding up the wrong thing here. I believe it is it's being recorded and is online. In terms of a text, I'm not sure. I certainly can provide a text to anyone who has asked me for it.
Yes, we would hope to obtain the text and put it on our website, along with the other annual peace lectures. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Excuse me.
Are you familiar with the writings of an Israeli-born man called Gilad Atzmon?
No, I'm not.
Okay, that's
I'm not. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think Hilda has
Yes,
a
Hilda has a
here.
question. Yes.
What role do you think the media has in what you said?
What is the role of the media in what Rachel has shared today?
The media is always problematic. I think Muslims in particular feel the impact of that. When there are conflicts, for example, the media always goes to cover them, and that's their natural role. Consequently, Muslims are viewed through the conflicts that they read about and that are reported in the press. Similarly, Israel is viewed through the conflicts that occur, and very often the media has been very much influenced by a kind of narrative that has taken over quite significantly, and which has blamed Israel always for the conflicts. It's very interesting to watch how a conflict is reported on. It's almost never, it never starts with the provocation or the initial act. It always starts with the Israeli response. And the Israeli response is usually quite strong because it is a tiny nation constantly in defense of itself. And naturally, it's going to be punitive. At present, there are any number of issues that keep getting reported on over and over again. A young Palestinian girl who assaulted, slapped a soldier, and she's becoming almost a media heroine. And that keeps going over and over again. And unfortunately, the media is always interested in such stories rather than on kind of getting deeper into the serious and difficult issues that need resolving and that have been addressed, but they're not very sexy. And they're not, it's not blood and gore. And that's what has gripped so much of the media. And I think countries and peoples suffer as a result of that because of the way media just needs to have a kind of a sensational story, and that's how it starts. I think Israel has suffered a great deal by the media, and we those of us who are concerned about that very much hope that it can change. But it's only ever a matter of education. It's only ever a matter of breaking through.
Okay, we have a question here, firstly from...
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. Presently in New Zealand, we have a debate over whether there should be teaching in state schools of Bible in schools to our children. Do you think the creation story in Genesis can transform their worlds red in tooth and claw beyond the teaching of official, say, Darwinism or Marxism or capitalism?
If you look at all of the rabbinic teachers, all of the Christian theologians commenting on the Bible, all of the Jewish commentators quoting the Bible, and the Islamic commentators quoting on the Quran, you will always find that they are concerned to explain sensitively and within a context any aspect of the Bible. One of the difficulties is putting the Bible or the Quran or the New Testament in the hands of really fairly ordinary teachers who don't know much about the traditions and plunking them in front of kids, very often glossed by contemporary secular critiques of the Bible. And I don't think that it would really result in a great attitude toward the Bible or even toward the world. I think religious tradition should be taught by their teachers, by their own teachers, and they should be taught sensitively. They're not always taught that way. There are certainly religious schools of various kinds that do not exhibit subtle and highly educated ways of imparting their commentary on the Bible. But I would be a little hesitant to bring the Bible into the classroom, because my guess is that just like the media, they would just zoom in on the conflicts, which are certainly there. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's written extensively on this, particularly in Not in God's Name, he addresses the whole problem of violence in the Bible. And he does so very subtly, I think perhaps too subtly for many people, certainly too subtly for children. But there are ways of reflecting on these texts, and they do need to be handled with care.
It's a big topic. And Jamin, you have a question? Would you like to come and ask your question and present the gift, please, at the same time? Okay, question first.
Yeah, just thanks again, Rachel, for that. My question, your talk's called How to Think, or Can We Think Our Way to Peace? So I'm assuming that means that through our rationality we can find our way to peace. So I think this seems like a legitimate question, although now I think it's going to seem sort of ignorant probably. But on what basis do you rationally believe that those passages in the sacred text should not be taken literally? Is it more than just your personal desire that it not be so?
No, because just as the head of the ulama in Indonesia said, there are parts of the tradition that no longer cohere with the present reality. That has always been recognized by Christian teachers throughout the centuries, as well as Jewish teachers throughout the centuries, which is why those traditions do not exist just with the Bible and just with the Quran. There are commentaries, responses, sayings, there are interpretations, there are brilliant theologians, there are all of those texts that have responded to the times, to the place. That is where religion is alive. The original text is there only ever as the kind of stepping stone, the stimulus. But out of those lines in the sacred texts, which alone can seem quite shocking. I know when I tell people who've never read the Bible to go and read it, they tear their hair out. They can't believe it. They don't know how to read it. And I totally understand that. Because as a living tradition, it has always been interpreted by highly intelligent, highly rational individuals, people in the world, social leaders, political leaders, community leaders. They have been all types, and doctors and all kinds, in all those communities, in the Abrahamic communities. And I, for one, and I don't think anyone seriously would bifurcate rationality and religion or belief. They do not. A faith is not alive if it is not interpreted, lived out, and explained. And once it is explained, the rational mind is coming in and making sense of it and connecting it to our world, making it alive, making it relevant, and sometimes quietly not quoting aspects of the text or of the tradition that are problematic. And don't forget, every single tradition, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, had differing views among their most brilliant interpreters. There was never one view, never one book. In a sense, the person who reads one book is a fanatic.
On that note, I think I'd invite Professor Jamin Halberstadt to come and to present a gift on behalf of us all. This has been a very serious lecture, and I see the serious looks, and I think we take away a sense of that seriousness, and some of us have heard some very challenging things tonight, and that's good. Jamin.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group for sponsoring it, and for the university for sponsoring you and for supporting free speech. This is, I think this is the best kind of talk. It's really uncomfortable a lot of the time, and nobody agrees with you. So that's that's the best kind of challenging talk to come to, I think. No, I'm sure a lot of people do agree as well. But I really appreciate you coming out. My name is Jamin Halberstadt, by the way. I'm not a religious person, but I'm one of the members of the small Jewish community that we have in Dunedin. And as it is the Jews' turn to sponsor the feast lecture, I've been given the privilege not only of hosting Rachael, but also of, and we took a nice trip to the peninsula yesterday, but also presenting a gift on behalf of the group and the university. So this is for you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.